Yeah, Jeremiah, the first question that we usually explore with our guests is what got you interested into the field of architecture? Do you remember the first time that you knew that this is something you want to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a story I've told a lot. So when I was a kid, my grandmother took my mother and I shopping, and I don't remember what city we were in. I used to think it was New York City, but could have been anywhere, honestly. But what I remember most distinctly about that, I think I was maybe somewhere like 3, 4, 5 years old, and all I really remember about that experience was getting yelled at for sticking my head out the cab window because I wanted to stare up at all of the really tall buildings. And later on, as I was growing up, I was always an artist. I was always drawing and creating things. And then, I was also always just really interested in history and in buildings. And, I'm like all architects, we're super annoying. We go to a new city and we have to touch things, we have to touch buildings. And so when I got into high school, I took a drafting class, and, that's really when I think I made the conscious decision to go to architecture school and to become an architect. But I think it was just something that was just kind of born inside of me. And there was no plan B. I mean, it was going to be this or this. There's really no other choice.
Okay. And what I'm interested to know, Jeremiah, particularly in terms of like you, from whatever the profile and the bio that I've read about you, you've actually worked across states. You've worked in Florida, you where you are right now in Virginia. So my question would be if you could speak to us a little about your early professional journey in terms of you finished architecture school, you work across the states. What then made you decide to stay where you are and start your firm here? What did those kind of process in a gist and capture that essence of that journey for you?
Yeah. Well, so to put all of that into a Reader's Digest version is a little bit of a trick because, I graduated college in 2003, so I've been doing this for 20 years. But early in my career, I made a conscious decision to do the one thing that everybody tells you not to do. And that is I worked for 5 different firms in 5 years. Or maybe it was 4. I'm pretty sure it was 5. And the reason that I did that is because I wanted to gain experience at different things. I also wanted to work at different kinds of firms. So the very first firm that I worked for in Jacksonville, Florida was KBJ Architects. They were the oldest firm in the state of Florida. They were distinguished as having the very first corporate architecture license that the state ever gave out. And I worked with some really great people there. My very first mentor, Walter Taylor, who was a fellow, was one of the partners at that firm, and I learned an incredible amount of information about architecture, about design, even just kind of life in general, working for him, and that was a wonderful experience. And then from there, I worked in Virginia for a little while in McLean, and, learned really quickly that I did not enjoy doing kind of, large scale spec home developments for developers. And so I moved back to Florida, actually went to work for KBJ again. They hired me back after about a year, and then worked at a couple of other firms. Sort of KBJ was kind of a larger, I'll call it a commercial firm. I think at their biggest, we had about 60 employees at that firm in 2 offices, Jacksonville and Orlando. And then kind of progressively went to work for smaller and smaller firms until we moved to Arkansas, to Little Rock, and moved here to work for a very small firm. My wife has family that lives in Kansas City, so we had 2 young children at the time. And wanted to be a little bit closer to family. But the firm that I worked for here had a specialty in historic preservation. And so that was also sort of a theme. Each of the firms that I worked for, they all did a little bit different project types. So, KBJ, we did airport work. We did a lot of educational, like dormitories and things like that. Also did a lot of hospitality. And then the other firms that I worked for, one of their specialties was clubhouse design for these larger residential communities. And as well as commercial strip centers and things like that. And then, another firm that I worked for, they did a lot of ecclesiastical and educational work. So, I was sort of picking up all these different experiences at all these different firms. And then moving to Arkansas, I sort of, got into historic preservation and have always been really passionate about older buildings and, kind of, adaptive reuse and, how do we maintain this, this rich architectural heritage that we have, really all across the country. And so while I was working there, I finally finished my exams and got licensed. And shortly after that, I found myself in a unique position where I had been moonlighting for a while, and I had more work than I could handle. And so the moonlighting, as I like to say, it started bleeding a little bit more into the daylighting. And I was having to, take calls while I was actually working at my day job. And it was just starting to get really problematic. And so, I kind of sat my wife down. I was like, look, it's, we're at a point, it's got to be one or the other. I can either kind of start saying no and just finish up these projects and just do the day job, or, we can start this company. And that was 10 years ago, that we started Rogue Architecture, and it hasn't really slowed down since. So I guess we're doing something right.
Sure. And actually from that, Jeremiah, I have a question for you. Like you said, you were always conscious about these experiences that you wanted, that you switched to firm every year. What was your headspace like at that point? Were you chasing, as a young architect who's just come out of school, were you chasing project types, different project types? That's why you did that? Were you chasing, oftentimes from what I hear from interviews is certain firms don't give you the space to grow in terms of your career progression with it. Was that your incentive? What is that incentive that you had that was driving you to kind of seek these diverse experiences through?
I think the driving force is just the fact that I love architecture. I mean, I love not only the sort of craft of what we do, but the science and even the business of it. And I wanted to learn, and I still want to learn as much as I can about this profession, whether it's building science and technology, whether it's design, whether it's history, running a business, interacting with clients and people, and, learning more about how humans interact with space. I'm one of those really weird guys that, I geek out on this stuff. I really love architecture. I love the practice of architecture. And so, early in my career, that was just it. I just wanted to learn as much as I could. I wasn't necessarily chasing anything specific. I was just chasing something new. New experiences, new design typologies, new firms, new ways of running a firm. Pretty much anything and everything. So the goal was always to be a firm leader, whether I was a leader at a larger firm or like what ended up happening, me starting my own firm. That was always the goal. I was never going to be an employee. I was always going to, move up to some sort of a senior leadership.
Okay. And, Jeremiah, this part, I think a logo and the name of a firm, again, tells us a lot about the person running it. You told us a story up until you decided, yes, you're going to be going ahead and doing your thing. How did the name Rogue for your firm come in? How is that? And why does it look the way it does? The graphics of it, everything. I'm sure you sat down and brainstormed it, but what was your psyche with that?
So all of those other firms that I worked for, I was paying attention and didn't necessarily understand it at the time, but I was sort of making a mental list of, call it do's and don'ts of how I thought a firm should be run. I think we've all been in those larger corporate firms that they're very top heavy. There's a lot of partners or associates or principals, whatever, at the top. And then, you've got this sort of small, camaraderie of production staff kind of in the middle. And then, you've probably got a few administrative staff. And in that kind of environment, things tend to be very insular. The production staff, that's exactly what they do. They sit at a desk, they crank out drawings, and that's it. The principals, they go to meetings, they meet with contractors, they, maybe they're even going out onto the site. And there's not a lot of opportunity to grow in a firm like that. Versus smaller firms where, as an intern, you may be doing the job more of like a project manager or project architect. You're wearing a few more hats. You have more opportunity to experience, the actual practice of architecture. And so as I sort of worked at, a larger firm and then kind of moved smaller and smaller until, I ended up at a 4-person firm when I was in Arkansas, or when I moved to Arkansas. I sort of saw some of the pitfalls, things that I did not, want for my own business. And so I just kind of sat down and I was thinking about that. And I was just kind of like, one thing I never wanted and was never going to do, it was never going to have my name on the door. It was never going to be like Jeremiah Russell Architect or, Russell Architects and Associates or something like that. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of architects, it's really hard to sort of admit this, but the work is not ours. These buildings that we design, these spaces that we create, they're not ours. They belong to the client. They belong to the end user. Now, the creative process and the overall design that goes into that, yes, that's ours, but it's in service of someone else, or something else. And so when I was thinking about the name for my firm, I wanted to focus much more on the work and sort of the operation of, are we going to be just the same old kind of firm, that are we just going to do things the same way we've done them for the last 150 years, or are we going to try something new? And I kept coming back to that idea. And so I was trying to think of like a word that sort of embodied that concept. And, rogue, it sort of has a dual connotation. It's sort of negative and positive. On the one hand, sort of that negative connotation is someone who is, almost in a violent way, kind of outside, society's bounds. But the flip side of that is the idea that we can color outside the lines, that we don't have to operate in the same way all of the time. We can step outside of our box and we can look at the box and we can think about it differently. And, how maybe I don't want a box, maybe I want a cylinder, maybe I want a sphere. And so that's kind of how it came to be, just the idea of being a rogue, being outside the norm, not following the same sort of traditional paths, but trying to do something different.
And so, Jeremiah, now we have the name and the logo. This is again kind of traveling back in time a little. You have your name and logo. Mm-hmm. You're starting your own firm. What did your first hires look like? How many people were in? How many employees did you have?
No, it was just me. And it was just me until, year 6, I think is when I hired my first employee, and she was with me for almost 3 years. But the first few clients that I had, they were, actually most of them were referrals. So, in terms of business, even when I was kind of moving from one firm to another, one thing was always really conscious of and never wanted to do is burn a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, most of my old coworkers, my old bosses, you know, they're still colleagues. They're still friends. You know, I don't, at least, you know, I certainly hope that I've never done anything professionally, you know, at any of those other firms to leave any sort of a bad taste in their mouth. And so, like, one of my very first historic preservation projects was a referral from my boss, who I left his firm, you know, to start my own firm with a small break in between. And, you know, that project unfortunately didn't get built. The building burned down, which was a huge loss for the community. But it was a great project. It was literally just a porch. It was a historic reconstruction of an 1870s porch on a Victorian home. And, you know, going through the research process of that, and, you know, going through old catalogs to like find the right spindle details and everything else, it was a great project. And like I said, we also had that very large modern custom single family home. We had a few other projects. Some of them were smaller, some of them were a little bit larger, but, you know, I would say it was a little bit all over the place. And, you know, when you're starting a firm, really the word no is just not in your vocabulary. Not to say that you literally want to take every single project that comes along. You know, some you just might not be either well suited or well qualified for, but, you know, generally speaking, we had good relationships with contractors. We had good relationships, or I had good relationships with former employees, and they were nice enough to recommend us for some of these smaller projects that kind of kept us going and helped us build our reputation.
Okay, and Jeremiah, kind of growing from that again, like now when I look up the website for Rogue, as a sort of under tagline, it does speak about you've kind of brought into preservation, design, build, interior design. Coming to that, like you said, when you start off, you really don't have much scope to say no. You're kind of playing by the ear as it coming in. But you having identified those, is that speaking to a niche? Like, are those things you enjoy doing now? Are you at a position where you are saying, I'm going to take only these kinds? Or is it something you're saying that this is our focus, we're good at this? This is, what does that speak to? What is that? Why was that put on the website itself is what my question would be. What was your headspace like that?
Yep. So the website is in process of being redone. And so I would say our focus is shifting a little bit. You know, for the last 10 years, our focus has mainly been on custom single family homes and historic preservation. Historic preservation, you know, you sort of end up a little bit all over the place because, you know, adaptive reuse lends itself to so many different things. It's really up to the sort of the building to kind of tell you what it should be or could be, as well as, you know, the developer or owner that kind of comes to you with a vision. And so through historic preservation, we've done a lot of adaptive reuse as multifamily affordable housing. And that is something that I am really passionate about. And so, you know, over the years, I've gotten very good at doing a lot with a very little. And so that's kind of becoming our focus, where we're shifting, not necessarily shifting away from custom single family, but just kind of marketing more the multifamily and the affordable housing projects that we do.
So with respect to that, Jeremiah, how does it tie into the fact that I know you're licensed across 14 states? Your focus is shifting towards affordable housing. How does the operations look like at Arkansas? Because like I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, for affordable housing, it's very subjective how you approach the process, how you work with the contractors on ground in every state, right? true for every project, more so for affordable housing, I would say. How are you kind of featuring into that transition, having given you started off all by yourself in Arkansas, but with this focus changing, I think it changes the nature of the operations too. If it does, how do you see that change happen?
It definitely does change the nature of operations. So, one of the things that I did very early on was I built the platform of my business in the cloud. So for almost from day one, I've used Dropbox as our server. I've never had a physical server. Our office is Mac based. So, all of my devices, they all talk to each other. It's very simple, very seamless. And I don't ever worry about not having access to the information that I need, no matter where I am in the world. And so as we've started to make this shift, sort of moving outside of Arkansas, I don't want to say it's been easy, but because I sort of built my business to be essentially remote since day one, it has been a lot easier, especially even through the pandemic, where, even during the pandemic, I didn't stop traveling. I had active projects in New Haven, Connecticut and Massachusetts, and was still traveling once a month for those, for site visits and client meetings and contractor meetings and everything else. But so, because I did sort of start out that way, the transition to other states has been relatively easy. It's also allowed us to focus our hiring, not necessarily location specific. So I have my office here in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then my business partner's office is in McLean, Virginia, which is on the DC Beltway. And, so we don't have to just hire, in those locations. We just brought on a new guy. He lives in California, and, which is great because he's 2 hours behind me. I'm 1 hour behind my business partner. And so, we have 3 people working in 3 different time zones. We have another person working with us. His office is in Bolivia. And, so we're able to remain kind of flexible and nimble in that regard, rather than focusing on a physical geographic location.
Right. And Jeremiah, another thing in terms of within the same ecosystem of finding work, working remotely, your website again talks about a 15-minute consultation on a phone call. I am very intrigued about what that 15-minute conversation looks like. In terms of, my questions would be, is it more of listening? Do you have a set of questions that you explore with that phone call when it comes in? Or is it more like an elevator pitch? What does that conversation look like? Is it the same, or do you adapt? How does it work?
I've tried over the years to create, some sort of form, of questions. And what I've found is it limits my approach to clients. So it's really a conversation. And, there's a ton of architects out there that are probably cringing right now that I do this, because I'll say it almost never lasts only 15 minutes. Sometimes it's a half hour. It could be 45 minutes. It depends on the client or, the potential client and, what the project type is. So, if it's a potential commercial client, that conversation is probably going to last a little bit longer because they might be in the due diligence phase. They may have already purchased the property and they're kind of under the gun to find somebody. And so, the amount of information that I need, changes based on that conversation. And so, I don't know, after 10 years of doing this on my own and 20 years being in practice, I guess I've just sort of learned how to talk to people and how to ask questions in a way that, I don't want just the sort of standard canned answers from people, like how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how many 2-bedroom units, how many 3-bedroom units. I'm trying to get at something a little bit different, trying to understand So for instance, with custom single family homes, I want to understand not just the program, not just what you need to fit in like a certain amount of square footage, but how do you want to live in this house? How do you, some of the questions I ask are like, do you entertain a lot? Do you have a large family? Do you have young children? Do you have older children? Are you going to be an empty nester in the next 5 years? Do you do you just really hate cooking and your kitchen only needs to be, like 25 square feet? Do you entertain a lot? Do you have catered events? Do you need large public events? Things like this. It's less about, how big does the bathroom need to be, and more about what does your life look like in this space? And then I sort of take that understanding and design around it. And so that's really where it starts with the consultation, is just to get to know the person or the people. And it's also about making sure that we're going to be a good fit. That goes back to when you're starting a firm, it's hard to say no. But when you don't say no, I think you learn very quickly that there are certain people or certain types of people that you probably just should not work with. There's another architect, there's another designer out there that's a good fit for them, because when you're designing someone's home, or when someone is entrusting you with hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars worth of their investment, it needs to be a good working relationship. It needs to be comfortable, and very early on. If you have to sort of work at it and kind of keep the relationship going, it's probably not going to be a project that everybody's going to be too happy about at the end. And that's what we want to avoid, hopefully at all costs.
I think those were some very useful things, Jeremiah, you shared. You make it sound very easy but I think it comes out of you kind of being, one, very intentional through the process and the years you've put in with work. The bit where I think you ask the questions that sets them up for success immediately, in terms, I think, very important of the questions you ask. But what does that instinct look like that you've developed, Jeremiah, in terms of what you're saying when you're saying whether that relationship works for you? What does that instinct drive you to, maybe not direct questions that you're asking that give you answers to? What is it that you're looking for, not looking for?
So I would say a couple of red flags that I think really all architects can look out for when they're interviewing a potential client. And I always call it an interview. On the website, it says consultation, but I guess that's a little bit of a misnomer. It's really an interview, and we're interviewing each other. And a couple of the red flags that I think are probably fairly universal are, A, if they want to know about cost up front before they've really even told you anything about the project. What does it cost for you to XYZ? That's a red flag. That's not somebody that I'm going to be too excited to work with, because they're just shopping around to get the lowest price they possibly can, because they don't really see any intrinsic value. They don't see the architect as being an investment in what they're building. They simply see us as a service provider, and that's probably not something that I'm going to be too excited about. Second one is when they immediately start talking about how long it's going to take. And so, but if I get through a conversation with a potential client in an interview, and we've had a great conversation, but then at the end of it, I always ask, do you have any questions for me? Clients that I'm looking for, once it gets to that point, they're first going to ask about process. Like, if we hire you, what is it going to look like to design this project? And then I get to tell them about sort of how I work, what I do, how I plan on interacting with them. And then if they want to talk about, potential costs and timelines after that, that's much less of a red flag. I mean, let's be honest. We're all in business to make money. Our clients, they're going to invest a significant portion in construction. And so, yes, they are going to be concerned about cost, but that should be something that's ancillary coming at the end. And so the clients that I'm excited to work with, and we've been very fortunate to have a lot of people like this, they're excited about the process. They're engaged in the process. Even like I said, from that initial kind of interview or consultation, they're inquisitive. They ask questions. They have input. Because at the end of the, if a client all of us think it would be great for a client to come to us and just be like, design me a house, just go do whatever you want to do. No, that's because then you're going to design your house, not their house, and they're going to hate it because they're not you. We have to have clients that are gonna engage with us and participate in the process. Because again, at the end of the day, it is their project, it's their building. They're going to live in it. So those I think are the types of clients that I look for most often.
Okay. I know now recently, I think in 2023, you had a new joinee to the team, a principal design, like you mentioned, Virginia. What does that decision process look like? Like you see X amount of work coming in, then you decide that there's growth, we're going to start a new office, we're going to have somebody head. Why, Virginia, what was your thought process like behind this whole move and this decision that you made? Mm-hmm. It's kind of Rogue growing, right? Rogue is growing as a firm, and you're opening these offices.
Yeah, it's definitely growth. So I had already been working on the East Coast, Connecticut, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Florida, and a really good friend of mine from college, Casey Price, he's my business partner. He has had his own firm for about the same amount of time. We both opened our doors in 2014, and he's not licensed yet. I hope he listens to this and gets his ass in gear a little bit. But not licensed, but has done a lot of really great work for developers in the DC metro area, and. He also has a degree in historic preservation. He got a dual degree from SCAD. And, his work lends itself to be generally a little bit more traditional, though he started doing a lot more modern homes in the last few years. And we both, we've always sort of kept in touch here and there over the years and just kind of, follow each other, see how each other's doing, that sort of thing. And we both kind of got to a point where you can only grow a firm so far on your own, just as either as a sole practitioner or as a firm owner with employees. There's only so many hours in the day that I have to do marketing and red lines and payroll and all of these sorts of things. And we both kind of found ourselves at the same point at the same time. I had been talking about being on the hunt for someone to come in more as a project architect and then kind of grow into a partnership role. And this was like end of 2022. And I had already planned on coming out to DC for the AIA Leadership Summit. And so Casey and I were just kind of talking about it. He's like, let's talk about that more. I mean, maybe there's possibility of us, joining forces and adding your licenses to the DC metro area and just grow the company. And, I lived in the area for about a year, like I said, and have always loved it out there in DC. And so I was like, well, okay, let's talk about it. And it was not a slow process. It was not a quick decision. I think we both thought about it very long and hard. It took about 6 months just to negotiate the partnership agreement, which, we're still sort of revising as time goes on. But I think when considering a partner, it's important to understand where the bodies are buried for both of us. And, Casey and I have known each other for 25 years. I think there's a level of trust between us, but there's also, I understand what his strengths and weaknesses are. He understands what mine are. And so we both bring those to the table. So far it's worked fairly well. And, if we can just increase our production staff a little bit more, I think we'll be in a really good place to see a lot more significant growth in our firm.
This sounds very, very exciting, Jeremiah. So
that's the hope. It's still a lot of work, though.
I feel like it'll be a missed opportunity if I don't ask you this one, especially because you are somebody who took up to technology very early on. Like you said, you got onto the cloud very early on. Coming out of the conference again, where much of the buzz is about AI, how have you implemented whatever you see in AI, or you foresee or plan to implement AI within the operations in your firm, Jeremiah? How do you see it fitting in? Where does it fit in for you?
AI, I think, technology for architects is never going to replace the architect. In the 70s and 80s, they said that, there were firms that refused to adopt, any CAD software because they said it was going to dumb down the profession. It was going to water down the profession. It was going to be nothing but a bunch of draftsmen. Architects were going to lose market share, yada, yada. It never happened. Same thing with BIM. They were like, we're just going to stick with AutoCAD because why do we need it in 3D? It's worked fine for the last, 4,000 years. AI is just another tool. It's something to add to our arsenal. It's something to add value to the profession and add value for our clients as well. AI has the power for us to save time and to, generate conceptual ideas or to translate conceptual thought quickly into a visual format. And, that I think is incredibly powerful because it's going to allow us to explore so many options that otherwise we wouldn't, because it just takes so long to, even if you're using something that's very quick and intuitive like SketchUp, it takes so long to create, a conceptual model or to sit down and sketch floor plan option after floor plan option. The most I think we're ever going to do in the sort of current reality is maybe 4 or 5 options, of like floor plans or, 2 or 3 options of an elevation or something like that, just because the availability of time is finite on a project. But if we can leverage AI, then suddenly, that 3 or 4 exterior options, maybe that turns into, 30 or 40. Now, there's such thing as oversaturation or image overload, and we don't want to do that to our clients. That's why they come to us, is to sort of curate things. But I still think, for us inside the office, it's going to allow a lot more exploration, so that, we might consider things that maybe we weren't going to consider before, just because we are, kind of generating those images a lot faster. And they don't have to be polished. They don't have to look photorealistic. At the end of the day, it can be something for you to just, pull out a, roll of tracing paper and sketch over the top of. But again, I just think it opens a lot more possibilities for architects to explore and be creative.
Okay. And Jeremiah, so during the conference, actually, you were one of the speakers for the first few sessions that we had. And I have to admit that was one of the most interesting sessions I attended in this conference.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's awesome.
You actually introduced us to a new vocabulary. I think you spoke about intrapreneur and entrepreneur. We may understand the concept, but I felt like you put words to it for us. My question kind of stems from that, given the sort of mammoth of experience you've had across states, across firms, across positions that you've done, do you think there is a right time? You've heard people say that maybe 3 years you need to work with another firm, then start your own firm, or 4 years or 5 years, whatever that is for you. Do you think there is any such sort of formula that exists that you need to give in working under firms for X amount of times before you start your own firm? Is there a right time before you start your own firm?
There's definitely not a formula. There's definitely not a right time. I don't think that there's a wrong time either. Whether you're at the beginning of your career or at the end of your career, I think there's always time to experiment, to take a risk, to take a chance, and to do good or even do better work. One of my favorite quotes is by Richard Branson. Sir Richard Branson. He's been knighted. Is say yes to everything. Figure out how to do it later. And that's, maybe that's a dangerous attitude to take. It's certainly a risky one, but it's worked fairly well for me for the last 10 years. I would say at least get licensed first. There is, I think there's unnecessary risk in unlicensed practice. It can be done. I did it for years, but I was always very careful about how I represented myself, never calling myself an architect or an architectural anything. I was just a designer.
When you started Rogue, Jeremiah?
No. I was licensed when I started Rogue, but I had been moonlighting since, almost day one, when I got my first internship. But doing very small residential projects only, and no new construction. It was all like renovations and small additions. Unlicensed practice can be fairly risky, and you do have to be very careful about sort of how you represent yourself. So I would say at least get licensed first. I think there is a lot of benefit to working under a principal. So working somewhere that you're going to have the opportunity for real mentorship. If you plan on starting your own firm, or if you plan on, as we talked about in the session, being an entrepreneur, someone who wants to move up within a larger organization. I think that mentorship is important because it's going to teach you two things. It's going to teach you the qualities that you should develop, and as well as the qualities that you should not. And those are, that level of self-awareness, I think, is very important if you plan on being a firm leader. Understand your strengths and your weaknesses, and be able to be very honest and very candid with yourself.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be somebody who works your process through a lot of lists. You mentally seem to have do's and don'ts. I want to kind of pick on that. If suppose our listeners are listening and they're at a juncture where they are going to start their own firm, that's something they've decided. Can you give me one do for sure and one don't for not, like definitely not to do, beginning right at that juncture when they're starting their own firm?
Well, the first, I think, obviously the first thing to do is just decide that you're going to do it. Once you've gotten to that point, names are not terribly important. However, business structures are. Mm-hmm. Don't do anything under a DBA. Only work either under an LLC or an S Corp or some sort of a formal business structure. That is a definite do. Don't be afraid to fail. Failure is the only way that we learn. It's the only way that we grow. It's the only way to absorb a life lesson or a professional lesson. I certainly haven't done everything perfectly in the last 10 years, but where I have fallen short or where I have failed, I've learned a very valuable lesson. Sometimes expensive lessons. Let's be honest, mistakes in business can cost money. But that's okay. You pick yourself up, you pay the bill, you move on, you learn, and just try not to do that again. So I think those would be the one do and the one don't. Always operate under a formal corporate structure, and don't be afraid to fail.
Thank you, Jeremiah.